Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our webinar on extranets in SharePoint and single sign-on to Claims apps. Sorry, I just realized I didn't update the title on the slide. We'll have to come back and fix that. My name is Peter Carson, and I'm going to be the presenter for today. I'm the president of Envision IT, and I'm also a SharePoint MVP and a partner seller with Microsoft Canada. We're going to post the slide deck up on our event site after the presentation, so you can get all my contact credentials from there. And we're recording the session, so if you have colleagues who weren't able to join us today, want to be able to come back on demand and view that, we should have that up tomorrow, and we'll send out a follow-up email to everybody as well. Also on the line, I've got Dinesh Sohan, who's our Director of Products. He's the lead guy in charge of Extranet User Manager. And we also have Logan Guest, who's in charge of sales. If you have any questions from a licensing, purchasing, trials point of view, Logan's your guy to follow up from that point of view. And again, slide deck is up there. All the contact info will be there. All right, so let me take you through a quick overview of what we're going to cover for the next hour or so. So from an agenda perspective, we're going to start with a brief introduction to extranets, make sure we level set everybody on what an extranet is. We'll talk about some different scenarios, cover off the licensing, not only from an Extranet User Manager perspective, but also from a Microsoft perspective. And then we'll get down into the details of what Extranet User Manager actually is, what does it provide to you, and we'll take from there into an actual demo. We'll walk you through our standard demo site, but we'll also have a look at some of our client sites as well. We'll wrap it up from there. As we go through, feel free to post questions. I probably won't get a chance to respond as we're going through, but we'll try and hold a little time at the end to respond to that. Dinesh is online as well, so he'll be able to respond to questions as we're going through. So with that, let's dive right into what is an extranet. Assuming everybody knows, being on the call here today, that's your interest, but I just want to clarify what our definition of that is. So an extranet is really a website that's accessible to users outside of your corporate network. So whether you've got information you want to share or collaborate with your customers, your partners, your vendors, lots of different scenarios of that, an extranet's a secure way to do that. And it can be delivered in a number of different ways. It could be part of your public website, and we'll show that on a couple of our examples. It could be a portion of your corporate intranet that you want to expose out securely, or it could be a completely standalone extranet. All three of those scenarios make a lot of sense. So I mentioned a couple of the folks that could come in, but just broadening the list a little bit, beyond members, customers, vendors, could be suppliers. You might be a charitable or not-for-profit organization that has volunteers. Any type of organization may have a board of directors that needs to come in. You could be government working with citizens, educational, say, or scientific working with researchers, property management working with tenants, partners from a sales point of view, collaboration point of view, many more examples as well. So there's lots of different examples of who extranet users could be. You may only have one of these in your scenario, or you may actually have multiple through there. So that's really one of our first questions as we're starting a conversation with a potential client about building an extranet. The first question we want to answer really is, who is it that's coming into the extranet? What's that scenario? And what are some of the things about those people that we need to know? Do all the people see the same information? Is it a reference site that, regardless of who you are, you see the same content? Or is there private site depending on who you are? Maybe you're building a customer portal, and obviously every customer only sees their own customer information. Is there any sort of back-end member database that we need to be aware of? Is there a Salesforce or Dynamics CRM, say, from a CRM perspective, or some other database that needs to be integrated in? Extranet User Manager is quite extensible, and we can build those points of integration back in. And we'll talk to some of those with some of the client demos that we'll talk about towards the end of the session. Next is it just invitation only? Do you know who those external people are and you want to just be able to invite them in? Or do you want them to be able to self-discover and self-register on the site? Again, depends on the scenario of who the audience is that's going to be coming into the extranet. If people can self-register, though, then how does that approval work? Is it one set of approvers for all people self-registering, or maybe there's some key piece of information on the registration form itself that drives that approval process? And again, in the client demos, we'll show you some more sophisticated examples of what that can look like. And kind of to today's topic, where we're talking about not just coming into SharePoint, but single sign-on into claims-aware apps in general, is it just the SharePoint extranet that they're accessing, or are there other systems that they need to come to as well? All right, so moving from there into the technology side of things, our focus is SharePoint, whether that's on-premise 2010, 2013, 2016, or Office 365. A lot of what we're doing in both of those scenarios is hosted in Azure or in the cloud these days, and then our Extranet User Manager, of course, that we're going to be talking about as well. So those are the core technologies that we focus on. Having said that, I mean, SharePoint is not a requirement of our solution. If you have an implementation that doesn't need SharePoint at all, but does require external user management, we can certainly do that. And that's part of the topic today, is how do we provide that authentication into any application. So when we install our product, we actually install it just into a plain vanilla IIS web server. It doesn't need to be on a SharePoint server itself. So there's no dependency. It's just that that tends to be a typical scenario that we get involved with. So on that side, what I want to do is start off by doing a couple of quick polls to get a sense of what are people currently using from a SharePoint point of view. So I'm just going to launch this poll out. And if you take a minute just to answer out, you can select multiple. If you're both in the cloud and on premises, go ahead and choose both of those. And we'll just give you another 30, 40 seconds to answer that. And then what I'll do is I'll share those results out so everybody can see how things play out from that perspective. All right, we've got almost everybody there. Let me just close that out. Let me share that out so we can see the results from that. So 2013, not surprisingly, the predominant. Actually, quite pleased to see about a third of you are already working on SharePoint Server 2016, so that's awesome, and about half on Office 365. So it's a real mix. Obviously, some are both cloud and on-premises. A few still on server or foundations. And nobody's still on MOS 2007 or WSS. That's good. We don't actually support those products in our current versions, so that's good from that point of view. All right, so I've got one more poll that I want to do here quickly. Just, regardless of which version of SharePoint you're using, I want to get a sense of how are you actually using that today? Is it strictly from an internal collaboration point of view? Do you run your intranet from a staff portal perspective? Do you have an extranet today on there, or maybe you've got a public-facing website on SharePoint? Let's just get a sense of what that breaks out to. Okay, so let me just close and share that out. So not surprising, the predominant workload is internal collaboration. That's where a lot of organizations start with SharePoint. A lot of folks, almost as many though, using it from a staff portal point of view. About 2/3 already using it from an extranet perspective. I know we've got some existing customers on the line as well as new prospects, so that's probably a mix in there. And a few folks using it from a public-facing website. That's a workload that we did a lot of work on. We're doing less so now. There seems to be a diminished appetite for Microsoft to use SharePoint from a public-facing point of view. But actually, one of the client demo scenarios I'm going to show later talks about how we're using SharePoint Online in the cloud from a CMS for a public-facing website, and then we publish that into Azure. So that's a pretty cool example, and that talks about some single sign-in and other claims apps as well as part of that. So we'll get to that later in the session. All right, so let's come back to our deck here. So we want to start just from an authentication point of view. So you've got these external users, they want to come into your SharePoint. How does that work? What are our options for doing that? And there's a couple of different scenarios. We're going to start from an on-premises point of view, and the simplest is just straight Windows authentication. You've got accounts in Active Directory, typically for your staff, and they're already coming in through a domain-connected computer. They just single sign on right in. They don't see a login prompt, and away they go. You can actually use Windows authentication from an external user's point of view as well. Typically, you want some sort of reverse proxy in front of that that provides a nice login experience, but you don't have to. You could have just the browser challenge come up for them. That is certainly a scenario. Typically, we'd see that if you've got some back-end applications that are not claims aware, but do work with Windows authentication, and you want to provide that experience through there. The next one is from a forms-based authentication perspective, and this is actually how our couple years back version of Extranet User Manager used to work. It's very wired into SharePoint itself. Some of our competitors' products still do this. We're not keen on this as an approach. It really wires you into SharePoint that the installation has to be onto the SharePoint server itself. Really, the authentication is only against the SharePoint server. We did do some single sign-on implementations with forms-based to other apps. It was very very custom and very specific to each of those apps. So it's not a very general purpose way of doing that. And certainly the claims aware that we're going to talk about today is a much better model, and that's the federated identity model. And basically what happens here is you create what's called a trusted identity provider, and that's where the login happens. When somebody goes to SharePoint, SharePoint says, hey, I don't know who you are, I'm going to redirect you over to the identity provider. You log in there and you come back, and away you go from there. And the same thing happens with any claims aware application, not just SharePoint. The application says, hey, I need to know who you are, bounce you over to the identity provider. If it already knows who you are because you've already signed into a different app, that's where the single sign-on comes in, and it doesn't present a login form again. It just returns right back to that application saying, hey, I already know who the person is, here's their information, and away you go from there. So that's a great model, not just from SharePoint, from a general applications point of view. Our focus today is on-premise, but I do want to talk about the Office 365 side as well. One of our scenarios is single sign-on to Office 365 and to third-party SaaS applications, so it leverages this side of it as well. So the first scenario, we've just got a cloud identity. We're not really going to talk about that. Even the directory sync, I mean, you could use this if you're creating your external users in Active Directory, but really you'd want to do the same federated model that we just talked about for on-premises for Office 365 as well. And in this case, Office 365 does that same redirect over to your identity provider. The login happens from there. So the nice thing is the model that we've chosen, it's very flexible, not just for SharePoint, but for your single sign-on to your other applications, but also even for Office 365 too. So it kind of covers all the bases for us. We really like it from that perspective. All right. So let's talk about if you were using SharePoint, what are your scenarios from that point of view? We mentioned at the beginning, it could just be a publishing portal, or it might be a collaboration space, or both of the above. That could be installed on premises, could be up in the cloud in Office 365, or you could actually install SharePoint in the cloud in Azure. That's another option that some of our clients have done. And then again, with Extranet User Manager, we'll talk more about the underlying architecture of it, but it can be installed on premises for you as well, or it could be deployed out in Azure from a cloud hosted point of view. And we can host that on your behalf. We'll talk about the licensing in a minute as well. A couple of ways that you can bring your external users in. There is this concept in Office 365 of external sharing where you can invite people in. It's pretty limited. It's pretty much a lightweight solution. So it's fine for small scenarios, but as you get into broader scenarios, it doesn't really scale from that point of view. We already mentioned the forms-based authentication, some of the challenges there, and really that the federated identity approach is the best way to go from there. Not going to get into all the technical details here, but they're available in the slide. So by all means, feel free to download that, have a look, and dig deeper under the hood from that perspective. But from a simple sample architecture point of view, let's say you were running SharePoint 2016 on premises. You've got your web front end, your app servers up at the top on the left there, SQL to support that, and typically we would see EUM installed on premises in that scenario as well. You've got the rest of your gear on premise. You might as well install the whole thing there. We need a SQL database for EUM. There needs to be Active Directory there to support SharePoint. That could be in your internal network. It could be in your DMZ if you've got a secured area for it. All of that obviously needs to be behind a firewall, and then your external partners can come in through that. They can authenticate through EUM, and they can hit your SharePoint from there. So we don't really add a lot to the overall infrastructure requirements. I mean, you could install EUM right on the web front-end servers because all it needs is an IS server. We do like having it on its own independent server, just isolation point of view. Maybe you're not ready for SharePoint 2016, you're installing 2013. You can get EUM going on its own server, and then later when you upgrade SharePoint from 2013 to 2016, you don't have to touch anything on the EUM side. It's all there and stable and managed from that point of view. So that's a simple sample architecture. We'll show you some other ones as we get later on in the slides. So from a licensing point of view, I want to stand up this extranet. Who do I have to pay what in order to do that? Well, the first question is really from a Microsoft point of view. So this is the 2013 licensing. The same licensing applies to 2016 as well. Basically, when Microsoft moved from the 2010 to the 2013 licensing model, they did a really nice thing. They got rid of any licensing requirements for external users. So in the middle column, the extranet column, yes, your internal users still need client access license or CALs, and you still need to buy the license for the SharePoint server. But you notice below that for the external users, there's no CAL requirement there at all. And typically, if you're using SharePoint for your extranet, odds are you're probably using it for your internal collaborations. You've already bought CALs for your internal users. You don't need to buy anything net new for that because the CALs are not specific to the farm. If you stand up another farm specifically for your extranet, you have to buy a SharePoint server license for it, but you don't have to buy any additional CALs for your internal users, and there's no requirement for CALs for your external users. If it is a pure public-facing website, you don't even need CALs for your internal users, and that's kind of a different scenario from there. Now you do require SQL Server and Windows Server licenses. That's part of your core SharePoint licensing requirements. Now there are some legal rules around what an external user is and what that means. Often it's fairly cut and dried, but if you get into scenarios like, I'm the corporate arm of a franchise organization and are my franchisees external users because they're not employees of me, typically Microsoft Legal has said, no, those are actually internal users because they're not arm's length from you. So if you get into those gray zones, you might need to talk to your Microsoft account rep or Microsoft Legal to get a decision on that. But if those are true arm's length users, if they're customers of yours, if they're partners, vendors, what have you, those are typically pretty clear that those are external users and no CALs required. The other thing you might want to think about is Office web applications. I should actually update this slide. It's now called the Office Online Server in 2016, which you can also use with SharePoint 2013. And the nice thing here is if you've got external users that you're going to be sharing and collaborating with documents on, Word documents, Excel spreadsheets, PowerPoint presentations, you don't know what those external users have. Do they even have the Office suite installed on their client computer? You don't have control of that environment, so how do you manage that? Well, the Office Online Server allows you to have browser-based versions of Word, Excel, and PowerPoint, so those external users don't need those clients installed for them. And the nice thing is that for your external users, they actually don't need any license for that as well. So this is a completely free product from Microsoft. It installs on another server and then connects to your SharePoint farm. And for your external users, both reading and even editing those documents. Now, it's not a full Word, Excel, PowerPoint editing experience, but it's enough to get general edits happening from a collaboration point of view. No licenses are required there either. From an internal user point of view, if they decide to use the browser-based versions, all of your staff can use it from a reading documents point of view. If they want to edit those documents, the only requirement is that they have a current version of Office desktop license associated with them. They don't need it installed on the computer that they're accessing it from. They just need to be licensed as a user within your organization. So it's pretty straightforward from that perspective. Surprising for Microsoft, they've actually made the licensing pretty easy here. And then what does it mean from an Extranet User Manager product? I mean, we haven't gotten into the features yet. We'll get to that in a second. But just, what do we have to pay in order to stand up this product in our environment? Well, we've got two different flavors, a standard and enterprise edition. The main difference is actually around the single sign-on and the claims-aware apps that we're going to talk about today. So if you're just authenticating into a SharePoint farm, we don't care how big that farm is, how many servers you have, how many web applications or site collections. That's a standard edition license. As soon as you add a second application, whether that's maybe another SharePoint farm altogether, or you're doing a hybrid where you want your external users to get it into Office 365 and on-premises SharePoint, or maybe you've got your own third-party SaaS applications or custom applications that you want to authenticate into, that's considered an enterprise edition. So that's the difference between the versions, and the full details are up on our site. Now, the other decision point is, do I want to run that myself on my own servers, or would I like Envision IT to manage and run that in a hosted scenario for me? So the on-premise, the price that you see there is a one-time perpetual license purchase cost, and then there's an annual software assurance of 20% on top of that. The hosted version includes the license, includes all the Azure hosting fees, everything's built into that, monitoring, remediation, etc., as either $850 a month or $1070 a month from a standard or an enterprise version perspective. And all this pricing is in US dollars. Now, the other thing to consider is, well, we've got my production environment, maybe I want to stand up a development or a test environment as well. What do I need to do for that? Well, the good news is that that's all rolled into the pricing as well. So as long as you're current on your software assurance on-premise, you can stand up as many dev and test environments as you want. There's no additional licensing required for that. From a hosted perspective, we do provide a dev tenant as part of that. We can talk about if you need additional tenants under that and what that would look like as well. So as I mentioned, all the pricing details are up on our site. We're very transparent and we expose all that for everybody to see. Okay, so we've talked about extranets, we've talked about how we license them. We haven't really talked about, well, why would I buy Extranet User Manager? What does it actually give to me? So let's walk through the feature sets, and then we'll move from there into the demos. So first and foremost really is around a branded experience. We're going to show you the Kinross site a little later in the session. It's one of our showcase clients in terms of the branding work that they've done there. And they actually did the branding work for the most part themselves, and I'll talk about customizations and how that happens. But the idea is that you want to be able to maintain your corporate brand through that entire user experience, not from just a registration and a login point of view, but all the emails that go out, all the end user pages for things like change password, reset my password, etc. You want that brand throughout all of that. And we've got a .NET Master page that we can modify, or we can provide developer guidance. There's a developer documentation up on our site of how you would do that branding and customization yourself. Next is single sign-on. So this is kind of a core topic for today's session, is the ability to authenticate not just to SharePoint on-premises and Office 365, but to other applications, whether they're your own in-house custom-developed applications or they're third-party SaaS applications. One of the examples we'll talk about later is Desire to Learn. So one of our clients, OCAS, authenticates not only to Office 365, but to D2L as well, and it uses the same login experience and single sign-on across that. So once they sign into their first system, whichever it may be, as they go to their second or subsequent from there in the same session, they don't see a login, it just seamlessly takes them in from there. So in the OCAS scenario, it's nice because they go into their Office 365 portal, they have a link there to go into their training learning management system, they click that link and they don't see another login, boom, they're just into D2L and away they go from there. It's all managed through SAML tokens, so it's all done through modern security standards that are used by vendors across the board. The next is our Easy Realm Home Realm discovery, and this is about making that login experience as seamless as possible, regardless of whether I'm an internal user or an external user coming in. So if you're hitting that first site and you haven't been authenticated to any sites yet, whether that's SharePoint or something else, it all goes through this same Home Realm discovery. So the first question is this user coming from an internal IP address? This is a good tag for us to be able to determine, is this somebody who actually works for the company, they're an internal user, and they're inside the office of the company itself right there. So you can maintain a list of IP address ranges in the configuration of the product. If we see that you're coming from an internal IP address, we assume that you're an internal user, and we're either going to go through Windows Authentication or Active Directory Federation services, however you've set up your SharePoint to take you into SharePoint from there. And if that's properly configured, independent of our product, your staff should never see a login as they're coming into SharePoint from on-premises. It should just take their domain credentials, pass it right through, and away they go from there. So let's say they're coming in from outside though. They're not on one of those internal IP addresses. We have to present a login form. But we still don't know whether that user is an internal or an external user. So there's a couple ways that we can do that. Quite often we put a link on the login form for staff login to let them bypass that and go to the regular staff login. The other way that we do that is based on a lookup of email domains. So we can say, okay, if they typed in an email address, because we'll show in a minute on the login form, email is the username. If they did type in an internal email domain, again, just take them down through that internal path and let them log in with their regular Active Directory credentials. If not, then we need to continue with the login process, ask them for a password, go through that Extranet login, and then come into the site from there. So it looks complicated here, but the goal is from an end user point of view, whether I'm a staff or an external user, it's very clean and simple for us, and it kind of guides you through the right path from there. Now, if I'm an external user, though, you may have additional security that you want to put on there. Maybe just an email address and a password isn't enough, depending on the security of the site itself. So we do support now multi-factor authentication. This is built through an Azure MFA service. So you do need to subscribe to that Azure service, and there is a cost associated with it. I think it's 15 cents per validation that happens through there. So let me walk you through what that looks like. So I come to the login form. Maybe I'm on my smartphone, I'm on a desktop computer. I enter my email and password, that passes, so I've provided valid credentials from there, but we want to do that second factor authentication. So that can either be a phone call or an SMS text message. You configure it on a per user basis to that user. They have to respond to that back to Azure. Once Azure is happy with that, then it allows the login to continue and you're into SharePoint from there. Now we put some smarts around that, so this doesn't need to trigger every time somebody logs in. You can define the rules around that to say, you know what, I only want it to fire on new devices or coming in from new IP addresses, or somebody that's failed a login attempt or has maybe reset their password and hasn't successfully logged in yet. You know, all those rules can be built out in terms of when the MFA should trigger. Because ideally, both from a user experience point of view and from a cost of doing the second factor authentications, you want to minimize where you're doing those to the highest risk scenarios. If somebody, has never logged in from Southeast Asia before and suddenly they are, maybe they're traveling there and we should do a second factor authentication, or maybe that's a hacker attempting to get in and we should block it from that point of view. It really depends on your scenarios through there. Next is self-registration. So I mentioned at the beginning, you may have an invitation-only process where you know your external users, or you may want to present a form. And Public Health Ontario is one of our examples we're going to show later of a registration form. So this is fully customizable. It's actually its own Visual Studio project that you can add fields, remove fields from. We can build custom rules and requirements and approval processes around that. So this can be as simple or as complex as it needs to be depending on your client requirements. And we're actually revamping the architecture of this in particular to actually make it even easier to customize from there. We're moving to a REST-based backend and a client-side coding on the front end. Without getting too technical, the idea is that you should be able to make some HTML changes on your form and publish that and have that work against your backend from there without any requirement for Visual Studio or recompiling or anything from that perspective. Forgotten password, this is kind of an obvious one. You've got external users coming in, they may be infrequent. It could be 6 months since they last logged in, they don't remember their credentials. I don't know about everybody on the line, but myself, I've got different passwords all over the place. Keeping track of that is sometimes difficult. So you need a self-service process around that. So it's quite straightforward. I'll show you it later. You type in your email address, you request the forgotten password email. It generates a one-time use, time expiring token in that email. I click on that link, I get to a page where I change my password. So one of the things is both when we onboard new users and when people forget their passwords, we never ever send passwords in clear text emails. It's a really bad idea. And that's one of the challenges with a lot of extranets, just how do we get our credentials to our end users securely? So this is our secure way of doing that. Once that token's been used, or if the time has expired on it, it's no longer valid, it's useless to anybody at that point in time. And the idea is that the end users themselves should only ever be the ones that know their passwords. We actually don't support a way for an administrator to set up a password for a user. They can request a forgotten password email, but we clearly don't want the administrators to know the end user's passwords because that's a security issue as well. End users often share passwords between systems, and we shouldn't have any visibility to that. They're one-way encrypted. There's no way to reverse engineer them under the hood, even if you've got admin access to the system. So it's secure from that point of view. From a versions point of view, we saw most people on 2013 and 2016, a few on 2010. All of those versions are fully supported. The authentication model in SharePoint hasn't really changed. It changed fundamentally when Microsoft launched SharePoint 2010, and it stayed quite consistent from there through 2013 and 2016. So there's very little, if any, changes we had to do to our authentication process, even to support SharePoint 2016. Setting it up is quite easy. There's a PowerShell script that comes after you install our product that you run on the SharePoint farm, and it basically registers our product as an identity provider to SharePoint. So it establishes that trust between, and then away it goes from there. So we don't need to install anything. We don't need to change web configs on your SharePoint farm. There's no custom modification of SharePoint going on. There's a standard Microsoft supported PowerShell script, and everything else happens in central admin from there. The same is actually true for Office 365. It's a very similar script that you run against Office 365 for it to trust the identity provider, and away you go from there. We're actually doing a webinar next week on Azure B2B, which is a different way of working with Office 365. One of the caveats is if you use this approach that I'm describing here right now, it does require your users to have licenses and subscriptions, even the external users in Office 365, but we've built in Azure B2B support that doesn't require that. That'll be the topic for next week's webinar. So if you're curious more about the 365 side and the licensing side, stay tuned, hop onto that webinar. We'll dive more into that side. Adaptive design, mobile first is the buzzword you hear from everybody. It's really big at Microsoft. Everything needs to be targeting a mobile platform. So all of our end user pages are built using the Bootstrap framework, very common CSS framework for building mobile friendly sites. So the pages morph and respond to the form factor of the device that they're on and work very well from that point of view. This idea of delegated user management. So, you've got potentially maybe hundreds or thousands, even tens or hundreds of thousands of external users that you're going to be managing. It's not going to be one person that manages those external users. You need to be able to delegate that down, and that's a core feature of the Extranet User Manager. This idea that you can assign groups and group owners and delegate the management of that group to folks not just within your organization, but you can actually delegate it to the external organizations themselves. And when we do our demo walkthrough, I'll show you an example of what that looks like. So you can have a very federated model to the management of the users themselves. IT doesn't need to manage those accounts. And that's a key thing. IT doesn't want to be the gatekeeper, and the business doesn't want them to be either. So this kind of satisfies both sides to that. I mentioned when we were talking about the licensing, we can host it in Azure for you, or you can install it on your own on-premises server. The hosted version, it is a multi-tenant environment, but it is separated. Each client has their own IIS site. Each client has their own dedicated SQL database, so there's no sharing of the data. There's no way to cross those boundaries between tenants from that perspective. It's managed by us. We have a third-party network operations center that provides monitoring and remediation 7/24 against that. So that's got that uptime, plus it's hosted in Azure in a highly available environment as well. So it's a very available structure, very low maintenance for you as an organization. And last but not least, multilingual. We're a Canadian organization, so bilingual was very important to us at the beginning. Many of our clients require English and French support. That's, as we become more global, become a much broader set of languages. So we've genericized that. We've got support for what's called resource files, where all the text is provided. So if you want to add new language support in there, if you're not happy with the translations or even the English copy that's in there, you have the ability to update those resource files and provide those translations. All right, so we're going to get deeper into a couple of these scenarios from a client's point of view, but we've got clients across a broad spectrum of industries, whether it's not-for-profit, charitable organizations, public sector, manufacturing, construction, mining, education, healthcare, fairly long list and actually growing all the time. We haven't updated this slide in a little while. There's been quite a number of additions to that as well. We're about halfway through the webinar. What I'd like to do now is take some time and actually go through the demo with you. So what we're going to demonstrate today is going from registration through login into SharePoint 2013, and then we're going to talk about single sign-on into other apps from there. And then, as I mentioned, we're going to go through some client demos and reviews as well following this session. So again, all the links will be in the deck and uploaded in there. What I would like to do, though, is I'm going to paste out those links to everybody now. So if you want to interact with them as we're going through, you'll be able to do that. So give me a second here. Sorry, cut and paste is not cooperating. There we go. All right. So the first link is really the important one right now, and this is the actual registration. It's where we're going to start the process. So let me actually take that link. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to run 2 browser sessions. So I've got my main Chrome session here. I'm already logged into the Extranet User Manager product. We're going to come back and do a bit of a tour through here, but I want to start from the end user's perspective. So I'm going to open a second incognito window in Chrome and act as the end user. So I'm going to be wearing the 2 hats as we go through these scenarios. So we're going to start with the registration process. And as I mentioned, this is fully customizable. This is the out-of-the-box experience, and it's really a sample. I mean, I don't believe ever implemented the complete out-of-the-box for anybody. They've always had certain fields they want to either add or remove, or some business rules they want to put on that. But let me go ahead and type some information in here. And if you want to follow along on your side, you can use that first link that I sent and come to the registration form. We'll see your registrations in there in a minute as we go through the approval process, and I can actually approve everybody through there as well. Okay, I've got to answer a CAPTCHA here at the bottom. Sometimes easier than others. That one looks pretty straightforward. And go ahead and register. So I've left most of the fields optional on there. The only ones that were required were first and last name and email address. Email is really the key because that's the glue that fits it all together. It's how we identify you, it's how we send communications out to you, and it's how you log into the site from there. So what the system is doing right now is sending a couple of emails out to me. So there's one for an account request. So this is to me as the person registering, just confirming that we've got your registration. It does need to go through an approval process, and once that's happened, I'll get another email with instructions to set my password. So it's kind of a thanks for registering, and again, I'll show you in a minute how these get customized and how you can tweak and tune those. I see a bunch of others coming through there as well, so that's great. So let me get the one for myself here. Okay, so here's the email to me as the internal approver saying, hey, somebody just registered on the site. So there's a pending approval account for Peter Carson 2, and I need to edit their record and set their status to active. So I click on that link there. My login had timed out here, so I'm getting the login to get into the admin console. We'll notice down at the bottom here, I've got a staff login link. That takes me through ADFS and in from there. I wouldn't see this if I was internal, but I'm actually doing the webinar from home today. So I'm now into the admin console. Actually, the deep link didn't work for me there. Let me just click that again. There we go. So I'm on the edit user page for that registration that I filled in. So I can see the first and last name and email that was filled in. All the other fields were left empty. I could edit any of that if I needed to. What I really want to do is change their status from pending approval to active and decide what groups that I want to put them into. Now I need to put the user into this EOM SharePoint group so they'll have access to the demo SharePoint site that we'll be using later, and I'll talk more about the permissions there in a minute. So let's go ahead and save this. So what this is going to do is it's going to create the account. And under the hood, what we're doing is we're creating the accounts in a SQL database. It could be Active Directory as well. And then it's going to send out a welcome email to me to allow me to set my password. Okay. So I just need to wait a second for that set password email to come through. While we're doing that, let me actually bring up the search users page. So I can search by a broad variety of different status here. I can get all my users by default other than my deactivated. Let me turn off active users, imported Azure B2B. Let's just see the pending approval users. We see a couple of folks that have gone in through there. I don't see myself as the active one because I've already activated that account. So let me do another search here. There's my Peter Carson 2 account. And I can see the details from there. The other thing that I want to do, though, is we have the ability through Extranet User Manager to manage not only users, but groups and the users that belong to those groups. So I've got a group I've created here called Delegated Owners. It doesn't have any members right now. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add another owner to that. I can see I've already got my dry run account that I did before the webinar in there, but I'll add a new owner as a user, and we'll make that P Carson 2. And I'll explain in a minute what that's doing for us. Let's get that account fully set up first, though. So I've got my, yes, here we go. I've got my welcome email here. So again, fully customizable. We'll show that in a minute. So welcome Peter Carson 2 to the extranet. My username is my email address, so that's good. I don't have to remember that. And I can see here the time expiring token. So I've got until this time tomorrow to use this link to set my password. And that time range is customizable, and it can be defined differently for welcome emails. By default, they're 24 hours versus forgotten password emails, which are by default 2 hours. But again, you can set whatever range you want for that. So let's take that link. I don't want to open it in my main. I want to go over to my incognito window here that I've got. Oh, that wasn't it. Where'd we go? There we go. This is the window I registered on. So I paste that whole big long link in there. And what it'll do is it'll bring me up to the set password page and allow me to choose my own password. Now, from a password complexity point of view, we've defined some rules here. It needs to be a complex password between 7 and 16 characters in length, you can define these rules. If you want completely open passwords that are only 5 characters long and you don't care about security, go ahead and do that. If you want it longer, you can certainly do those rules. We've even had clients build in custom rules that they have as part of their policies through there. So let me use a complex password in here. Okay, so I've set my password, but I haven't actually logged into the system yet. So when I click on the home link here, it's going to take me to the login. We see that staff login. We don't want to do that. We actually want to use that ID that we just created. And I'll use the password that I just set. Right now we've got disclaimers turned off on this site. There is an optional disclaimer page that can come up. Oh, sorry, it is up. When I did my dry run, it wasn't there. It's just got lorem ipsum text in it right now. You can define your disclaimer. You need to accept on that and enter the site. And I should mention as well, from an audit point of view, all activity is audited through there, so that my acceptance of that disclaimer is recorded in the SQL database as an audit action. When I registered, who approved my account, any changes to the account, old values, new values, who did the change, when, is all recorded from an audit perspective. Even login history, both successful and unsuccessful, is all recorded in the database. So you have full access to that. We don't have out-of-the-box reports that will present that audit information. That's on the backlog for future versions, but you can certainly hit that database and create your own reporting if you need to from that perspective. Okay, so I've logged into the site, and I'm in what's called the landing portion of the site. So it's not SharePoint right now. I'm just in Extranet User Manager. Some of the things that I can do here is that I can update my settings. So I can come to a profile page that looks very much like the registration page. In fact, it shares a common control across that. We can implement different rules. Like here, we've said we're not going to allow people to change their email address. For most clients, they want it that way. Your email is your primary identifier. If your email is something at acme.corp and you no longer work at acme.corp, you shouldn't be able to change it to your Gmail account and continue to access our extranet. That's kind of the thinking around that. There are scenarios, though, where change of email is required, where those users, have changed their name and their email alias has changed as a result of that. You could have them do a help desk request and through the admin console have your help desk change that, or we could light it up and allow it here. It's really your choice from that perspective. As I save this information back, it's recording back into our SQL database and updating the profile from there. I can also change my password. If I know my password, but I want to change it from a security point of view, I simply enter my old, double enter my new one. I can then change my password from there. If I've forgotten my password, so let's actually do a sign out here for a second. I should have done this at the beginning. We can see here we've got the forgotten password. I can enter in my email address. And it'll send an email very similar to the one that we got as the welcome email. So let me actually come back and sign in. I don't actually need to use that forgotten password. It doesn't change anything on my account. It's just out there as a pending request that could or could not be used depending on the user. If for whatever reason they have a brain flash and they remember their old password before needing to reset it, they can certainly go ahead and use that. Okay. So right now we haven't configured the site tree in here to investigate the SharePoint site. What you would normally have is a link of the sites that are available to you. So let's actually go. This is the second link that I sent over to everybody. I haven't approved those accounts yet. Actually, let me do that so people are able to continue going from that perspective. So let's come back to our search of users. We'll turn off the active imported B2B users. We'll just get the pending ones. We'll take those 4 users. We can actually do a bulk set of status. So I can set all of you to active status. Now, the caveat here is I haven't made any group decisions yet, so I haven't put you in the groups that will give you access to SharePoint, but you'll still be able to log in to the top level of the site with that. So let's leave that at that point for now. Okay, so if I come over to my other browser session and I go to that second link that I'd given everybody, so that's my product demo 13.envisionit.com. So this is an on-premises SharePoint 2013 site. And even if you didn't bother going through the registration process with the links I sent out, you can still hit the second link here. The top level site is anonymously available. So anybody can come here. You don't need an account to get in through there. Now you notice at the top there's a sign-in link, and here's an access the private area link. Either of those actions are going to cause an authentication to happen. So if I click on the access the private area, if we watch the browser quickly, it went to login.eumdemo.com, but it didn't present a login form, it just came right back to product demo 13. So that's actually the federation happening. So what happened is my browser redirected to the login form. The login form said, hey, you already logged into me through this session here. I don't need to ask you for credentials again. I'm just going to create that SAML token, pass it back to SharePoint, and now I'm logged in as pcarson2 at envisionit365.com. So that's single sign-on in action. You can think of this as one claims-aware app and SharePoint as another one from there. You know, I can continue from there through there. In fact, I can click this link here. Let me open that in a new tab. This is actually a sample Visual Studio project that we provide to clients. If they want to build their own custom applications in .NET and have them authenticate through EUM, this is a good starting point to kind of explain how that authentication works. So there's not much to the project. And basically what it does is it wires up the authentication, and then it presents a page that shows all the claims of the user that's coming in. So again, apologies, it gets a little bit technical here, but basically what it's showing me is, you know, what are all the profile information that comes through, like my first name, my last name, my display name, what roles I belong to. So remember, I added myself to that EUM_SharePoint group. So all the groups that I get added to come across as a role in the claims there. So there's a fair bit of information in here. And as an application developer, I can use that claims information to drive how my application behaves, whether I let this user in, and what I'm going to let them do once they come in there. In fact, that works in the actual administration console itself. So if I come back here, I click on this landing admin link here, I can open up that in a new tab. You'll see a slightly different view than when I was over here. So let me just close this and come back to my home. You see here I have the configuration options for setting up the product, stuff about setting up groups and Easy Realm. So there's a fair bit of things that I can do through here. In my pcarson2 account that I've set up here, all I can do is search, add, and import users. And the reason that I get that is because I added this user as a group owner to one group. As long as I'm an owner of at least a single group, I get this functionality through here. And the way that we've configured it right now is a group owner gets to see all of the users in the system. So I could say, okay, well, let's look at that Peter Carson 1 account, and I actually want to put them into that delegated owners group that I was made an owner of. And you can see the other groups like the SharePoint. I don't own that group, so I can't take the user out of that. It's there as an unmanaged groups from my perspective. So I can only manage the groups that I'm an owner of, and away go from there. I've now put that user into that group. Now, when we were on the search page, I was seeing all users coming back through here. We can configure the system that group owners only see the users that belong to their group. And that's typically what we see if you're going to delegate group management outside of your organization. You know, let's say we've done work with a number of different insurance companies, and they want their brokers to manage their own staff coming into the parent insurance company's extranet site. Obviously, you don't want broker A to see broker B's users. That would be a clear confidentiality issue. So you set Extranet User Manager up so that group owners only see their own members. Broker A would only see people that are part of their group, and broker B would only see members that are part of their group. We've got that division through there. One of our clients, actually NAV Canada, kind of the FAA of Canada, they work with all the different airlines that operate in Canada. So what they do is they assign a sort of a super user administrator at each airline. That user owns their group and has the ability to manage the members that can come in from there. So that person can then invite in other users from that airline to work on the NAV Canada extranet. So different examples there from a delegation point of view. It can get fairly sophisticated from that perspective. All right, so we've covered off the main onboarding process. I said I'd give you a bit more of a tour of the admin console itself. So we've had a look at the search users, add users. We briefly looked at the groups. You know, we've got the ability to search that, bring up different groups. We can look at the membership from different perspectives. So I can come to the SharePoint group here. Actually, what I can do now is I can search for, actually no, you guys are active users. What I need and don't have on here is show me all the people that aren't a member of this group. So I'll come back later for those of you that registered accounts, and I'll add you into the group. But basically, you can check off multiple people through here, say OK, and then now become additional members to the group. So you can edit a group, manage its membership, or you can edit an individual user and manage their groups, depending on which perspective you want to take from there. What I do want to do is take a minute, though, to look at some of the other configuration options in here. So we talked about the emails themselves and how those can be configured. This is the welcome email that we saw coming through. It can be a plain text email, or in this case, it's a full HTML email. So you've got control over all the styling, the images that get used in there. And you can see we've got things like tilde display name. So those are placeholders that get mail merge replaced. So wherever you see those, there's a defined set in the documentation that you can use in your email templates. So there's 4 different email templates. There's a pending approval and approver. So the approval one is to the person that registered, just saying thanks for your registration. That was the first one we saw. The approver is, hey, somebody is registered, you need to approve them. That was our second email. The third is the welcome email that we saw, and last is the forgotten password email, which actually I've got the one that we generated before here. Let me pull that up. So again, it looks very similar to the welcome email. We can see here we've got a 2-hour rather than a 1-day expiry on that. That actually is defined right here in the token expiry. So that's some of the configuration you can do in there. There's a bunch of Office 365 and Azure B2B stuff in here as well that we don't need for today. All the Easy Realm that I was showing you before, if I go into the Easy Realm settings, we can see how that's defined. There's rules both on IP address and on domain. Now we haven't set up any IP address ranges in here right now. But we do have a rule that says if somebody types in at envisionit.com email address, then we should redirect to ADFS. And that's actually why I'm using the slightly different email domains of Envision IT 365, just so it doesn't get caught by this rule, because I want those to be considered external users. Okay, so let's flip gears and talk about some customer scenarios. Let me come back to my deck here. There's a number of different ones that I've got up here. Public Health Ontario. Let me actually walk you through. I think we've got the tabs actually open. So again, the links are all in the slide deck. You can have a look yourself through there. PHO is a public-facing website hosted on SharePoint 2010. It's using an earlier version of Extranet User Manager. They're actually using Windows Authentication. So they have their own front-end reverse proxy that's doing the login. But the registration form that we're on here, we can see is capturing my registration information, and then it goes through the process of auto-approving those people for general users. But if you're an elevated permission, maybe I work for one of the public health units provincially, there's an alternate process behind this to add those additional security rules to you. And that's all managed through Extranet User Manager, but it also ties in Forefront Identity Manager as part of that as well. Second one I want to talk about is Children's Aid Society. Actually, let me bring up another slide deck here for a second. So this gives an example of what the EUM infrastructure looks like for OCAS. So on the left-hand side is our multi-tenant environments. We've got EUM installed on 2 servers hosted up in Azure, and Traffic Manager is load balancing that. So if one of those servers goes down for some reason, the system keeps responding. And the SQL database behind that is an Azure SQL database. So again, that's highly available. There's 3 instances of that running, so it's very secure from that point of view. We've got an Active Directory under the hood that manages this whole infrastructure, but the actual external users are stored in this SQL database. And on the right-hand side, we've got 2 different claims apps. We've got the Office 365 tenant. So this is a publishing portal that has all sorts of resources. So the mandate for OCAS is to provide training and resources to the, I think it's about 8,000 staff of the 50-odd member societies for the various different municipal children's aid societies across the province. So all that content is hosted up in Office 365. They can register, sign in, and get into that content from there. But as I mentioned, they also do training, so they can come into this Desire to Learn training portal, which is hosted by D2L, but also is a claims-aware application. So we did work with them to customize the registration. So we write some profile information of those users into D2L, and then we provide the single sign-on claim into that, so a user can click on a link in Office 365, take them to D2L, and boom, they go straight in. They don't see a login form as part of that. And the way the registration works, and this is a good example of federated registration. So when I enter my registration information, I can choose an organization that I work for. Let's say I work for the Children's Aid Society of Toronto. There's an email domain that we know for that society. If I type in my email as being from that related domain, what we're going to do is auto-approve your account because we know the only way you receive that is because you do have that email address. You need that to be able to get in, so it's secure from that point of view. We don't need anybody to approve your account. If I choose that I'm coming, say, from other, and I type in some arbitrary email domain, then it's going to send the approval email to somebody to OCAS to review that, make a decision, and then, if appropriate, approve and send you off from there. Once that registration happens, we set you up in Office 365. We also set you up in Desire to Learn, and you can go into the portals from there. So that's a nice example through there. A couple of other ones we'll kind of skim through fairly quickly. Boys and Girls Club of Canada, and this is a nice multilingual example where the entire public website is available in both English and French. If I come into the members section here, we get a login form. We can come into a registration form. I can flip that back to English because I'm actually better in English than I am in French by a long stretch, and we can see how that registration works. Interesting tidbit on this one here is that it's connected into their dynamic CRM. When somebody registers, it creates a contact record in CRM as part of that. When you update your profile, it updates that CRM profile as well. So some nice integration through web services there. G2G Marketplace, this is for the state of Michigan. It's basically a portal to allow government organizations, state and municipal across the US, to be able to get pre-approved vendors for IT solutions. EUM being one of those solutions, but EUM is actually the front door to the portal itself as well. So when I sign in here, I need to register, go through an approval process, and enter into the marketplace from there. And then I can browse the marketplace, select products from there. Supreme Court of Victoria, the top court for the state of Victoria in Melbourne, Australia. Their commercial lists portion of their court. All court cases run through this SharePoint 2013 site that is currently hosted in Rackspace. We're actually just moving it to Azure as we speak. Again, I need to go through a sign-in process. If I'm a barrister or solicitor, I can create an account on here. As a case proceeds, you can invite other parties into it, defendant, plaintiff, third, fourth, learning a lot about the Australian legal system as part of this project, so it's been interesting from that point of view. But again, another example of a pretty rich extranet that has a lot of business functionality around that as well. Avari was one of the insurance examples that I talked about. Advisors have the ability to log into their portal through here and interact not only with the website, with a whole bunch of back-end applications. So single sign-on into other applications happening there. Kinross was the branding example that we talked about. Very cool implementation there. It's SharePoint 2013 hosted in the cloud in Azure. And we've got Problem Gambling. This one's actually just going through an update right now. It's using an earlier version of Extranet User Manager that's forms-based. We're moving that to our Federated model and SharePoint 2013, again, as we speak. So that's a bunch of different client examples. One of the other ones I want to talk about here, conceptually, I can't show you the actual client because it hasn't launched yet. We're still in development on it. It's very interesting in the sense that what's going to happen is they're going to host their public website in Azure, but they're going to use Office 365 for the content authoring for that. And what we've done is we've built a Office 365 to Azure publishing process. So page content, documents, images, such that get published in Office 365 get pushed out to Azure and are publicly available from there, because you can't bring anonymous users into Office 365. EUM is then used to authenticate against effectively this Claims app here in Azure. So they'll be able to access private content in there. But the client also has a number of claims-aware applications that they're hosting themselves. They'll also be in Azure, but in a separate tenant. That's also going to use EUM for authentication into there. So I register. There's a whole delegated model where there's sponsored users that can be set up under a master account in here, and then rights can be granted into the claims applications through here. And there's some client web services that get tied in as part of that as well. So it's an interesting model. Give us 2 months or so, we'll be launching that out. We'll be able to talk more about that from a case study point of view. Okay, so next steps from here, I mentioned Logan is your go-to guy from, if you want to get a trial going, you want more product information, you want to do a one-on-one demonstration with us, all those we're more than interested in pursuing with you. So happy to support that from that point of view. Also, from an upcoming point of view, I mentioned next week we've got our Azure B2B and Office 365 webinar. So there's a registration link up on our site for that. Actually, I should mention there's a February event that we're just posting up with a partner, B&R, down in the US. So that'll be coming up there as well very shortly. And then we're going to be in person at both SharePoint Engage down in Phoenix in March and SharePoint Fest in Washington, D.C. in April. We're planning some more events through the year as well, so keep an eye and see us there from exhibitor. And I tend to speak at those events as well. I'm actually doing an Extranet talk at SharePoint Fest and an Office 365 talk at SharePoint Engage. So again, the details are up on our site on those as those are coming up. So I think we're right at the noon mark. I timed it fairly well. Appreciate everybody's time today. As I mentioned, not sure if there was questions that were unanswered as we went through there, but feel free to reach out to Logan. We'd love to continue the conversation, do a one-on-one, get a trial or a demo set up for you, and go from there. So with that, thanks everybody for joining us today, and look forward to talking again soon. Bye now.